Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Sandy Bottom Homestead. I hope you're having an absolutely fantastic day. It is a beautiful day in North Carolina, coastal North Carolina that is. 86 degrees, no clouds in the sky, no rain, fall season kicking off, and we gotta do it. We gotta talk about fertilizing in fall. It's a different beast, and I have changed one of my fertilizers temporarily, so we'll see how that is, but it comes with caveats. And really what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna focus on organic fertilizing. That's what I typically do. I'm not above doing synthetic, but organic is the way that I choose to go mostly. And so we're gonna talk about different ways, and one of them is a water soluble one. All right, yeah, the garden is planted. You know from the last video, everything's going. We've given it 2 fertilizings at this point. So what I wanna do is I wanna talk about what fertilizers I use, what the fall crops typically enjoy more, and then my schedule that I do, because I do have a very specific schedule. If you fertilize at the wrong time in this season, you will have a higher chance of losing your plants. I'm not gonna say you'll definitely kill them, but there is a higher possibility of it. So we want to be very careful. We are marching towards the cold instead of away from it. That's the big difference in the fall season. So that being said, I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit in order. My first fertilizing is always, for every season, every time, is a pre-planting fertilizer. That's really pretty simple. I mean, it's literally put the plant in the ground, fertilize. And I use a granular fertilizer. And so that's gonna be my basis starting point for the garden. You know, if bare minimum, at least you have that set in place for it. And then you could have it moving forward. You can just kind of dance around it. You know, you could give a little bit more, but at least you have an initial feeding in place for the garden. At that point, we have to stop, and we know we've given it our initial fertilizing. So we know that it's got the pre-planting fertilizer. And what we know about our fall crops in particular, which is very different from our other season crops, is they're big nitrogen feeders. So they really like nitrogen. I mean, you've got to think about it. Brussels sprouts, eating leaves. Cabbage, eating leaves. Broccoli doesn't look like a leaf, but is basically a leaf. Same with this. Lettuce, bok choy, collards, kale, all of that is basically leaves that we're eating. We're not actually forming fruits, okay? So we don't need to be putting calcium and phosphorus and all that stuff in there. We do need to put a balanced fertilizer in. So my first fertilizing is generally pretty balanced, and I did switch. Actually, I switched both of my fertilizers for the fall, now that I think about it. The one that I used before was I believe it was a 4-6-6, something like that. So the first number is the nitrogen, and then you have your phosphorus, and then you have your potassium. And then I switched to like an 8-6-6, so it has more nitrogen in it. And so the basis for this is like pushing a little bit more nitrogen in. It's not a lot, it's not gonna make a huge difference, but we're kind of setting it up for the right purposes, okay? So once I get my plants in the ground, I give them about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And at that point, I don't put another granular fertilizer down. What I do is, through my injection system here, I will inject a liquid fertilizer that goes to all of the beds at once. So every single one. So this is where I've made a big adjustment. Typically I use a fish fertilizer, but this year what I've noticed is the raccoon, who is a total ass, has come in and it will dig up because it smells the first fish fertilizer, and it's digging up my garden. But more important, well, that's the most important, but secondly, what it's doing too is it's getting to the hoses and it's chewing into the hoses because it wants to get that stinky smell. So I had to kind of think outside the box a little bit and say, like, hey, what's next? What are we gonna do next? What can I change to eliminate this problem, because I'm having a hard time getting them. I did get some traps that are coming, so we are gonna try and trap them, but anyways. So I wanted to stay organic, and I wanted to stay organic for two reasons. One, because organic feeds the soil. Put like an organic granular fertilizer down, it doesn't just feed the plants, it has to react with the soil in order to kind of start doing its thing. And in return, what we're doing is we're building our soil microbiology. I mean, it sounds really complicated, but it's really simple. You don't need to go anything past microbiology and feeding. That's it. You really need to get all worried about what are the different nutrients and elements and all sugars and all that stuff. What we really need to know is like, hey, we're feeding the microbiology by fertilizing, done. Okay? Keep it simple, stupid. Kiss all day long. I love kissing. So if that's the case, then we know we've done that. So we want to inject into it, and we want to use an organic fertilizer, because the synthetic doesn't really, it feeds the plants fine, but it doesn't really do much for the soil, and it can add to like building up of salts and stuff like that. It's not necessarily going to happen. But the other thing is it's really easy to over fertilize with a synthetic fertilizer, which is something I don't want to do. But when we inject with a water soluble fertilizer, what that does is as soon as it hits that plant, it feeds it, right? The granular takes, at this time of year, it's going to take about 2 weeks to start to do it. As it gets cooler, it can take 3 weeks to a month for it to start to break down into the soil and start to feed the plants. So what we're doing is we're giving it a feeding at planting. It's starting to break down, it's starting to feed, and then bam, we hit it again. And then we're going to get a little bit of growth, right? And then that's done, that's gone. And then the organic granular fertilizer is starting to kick in a little bit more, okay? So now we're 2 weeks in, right around that 2 week mark roughly, depending on how warm you are, it should start feeding. So you're getting a continuous feeding of it. And what I did is I went and I looked up a water soluble organic fertilizer, and I ended up purchasing some Chilean nitrate, okay? So the other thing about the fish fertilizer is through the injection system, it kind of clogs it up a little bit. And what I noticed is it wasn't draining all of it out, meaning it would just kind of settle at the bottom because it's heavy. So we got this Chilean nitrate. It's mined in Chile, and it's nitrogen. That's what it is. It's nitrogen. I think it has a little bit of potassium in it. So it has no smell. That's what we wanted. We wanted something with no smell. Again, we could have gone synthetic, but we didn't. And so we did that, but it's got a little bit of a caveat to it, and it's going to cause me to adjust one way or another, and I don't really know how I'm going to do it. The big adjustment is it's recommended that, I can't remember off the top of my head, is either it's 20 to 40% of your nitrogen for the growing season. So typically, like the fish fertilizer, we could pump that constantly, just over and over and over. Well, this isn't really like that. You have to kind of work on, amending a little bit. And we would use blood meal, but when I put blood meal into the soil, it's the same thing. You can come out and there will just be scratch marks all in the garden. The dog, the cat, the raccoon, the possums, they all try to go after it. And in turn, they're digging up plants, and they are working on the hoses and biting holes in the hoses, especially like these sections right here that are kind of out of the ground a little bit. They go for them. And, if they bit like right here, I could just trim that off and like remove it. But usually what ends up happening is like there's a bad bite mark like in the middle. So I can't really do anything about it. So I'm going to have to figure out another amendment to put in. I can't use fish fertilizer. I can't use blood meal. I don't really know what I'm going to do at this point, but what I do know is after the second week, we're going to come back. If I was using a fish fertilizer, I would come back in 2 weeks later and I would hit again. Now I'm not using that, but now what I'm doing is I'm using a higher nitrogen granular fertilizer. So in about a week from now, or a month after planting, I'll add another dose of the granular fertilizer. Okay, so that'll put us about a month out from our first frost date. Okay, now you got to remember that. we've got to remember our first frost date's coming because it's really important. And so then what I would do is 2 weeks after that, I would hit it again with a fish fertilizer. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna skip the middle drip injection, and then I'll come back and I'll do the Chilean nitrate again on top of the granular fertilizer. And then at that point, we now switch to where we're starting to watch our weather solely based on our, our fertilization schedule. Because if you're planting with a lot of or fertilizing with a lot of nitrogen, you know that nitrogen is what causes leaf growth, right? This is what causes leaf growth, is nitrogen. Then when the nitrogen comes, it'll push growth, and then you get these nice tender leaves. Well, they need to harden off a bit before your frosts come, and then they will survive that. But if you just push it, and like, let's say we push it a couple days before, because technically our first frost would be around our next scheduled fertilizing, then what'll happen is it'll push more growth, and then we'll get a frost, and that nice tender growth right here will die back. And so you just are constantly like using energy to grow, damaging the plant, stressing it, so on and so forth. So at this point, we're going to start watching our weather and bouncing in between all of the different, if it's going to be warm for a stretch, then we'll fertilize. If it's going to be cold for a stretch, then we won't. Go on that way. But there's a bunch of buts here. There's a whole bunch of buts out here. So at this point, though, we will give another final dose, and I say final with a little asterisk right here, because you may, this could be the final, and we could do more, but what we know is at this point, the frosts are starting to set in, it's starting to get cool, and now that granular fertilizer is going to take longer to release. But the question you may be asking is like, well, why are you fertilizing with granular fertilizer if you're not doing the injection? Thank you for asking. I'm glad you did. Because all of that does not fertilize fast. It's very slow. And so you're not pushing heavy growth. You're still pushing growth, but it's not heavy. It's more controlled. It's released. I mean, the way I look at it is like when you give like a water-soluble fertilizer, it's like jacking them up on steroids for a little bit. It's like, bam, get that growth, calm down. Bam, get that growth, come. So we're kind of doing it in stages. That's not what I want to do at this time. At this time, I want to kind of slow down and just take it easy and not really push too hard. Now, with a variety of crops here, it's a little bit different of a situation, okay? So we've got broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. All of this is very long season. We need to push as much growth, especially to the broccoli, as we can to get it to start heading, to go. Clearly we're a ways off, but we've got to get this stuff going. And so we'll do that, and then we'll keep feeding it afterwards. Now, contrast that to this next bed that we're going to go to, and you can look at it and you can see it's totally different plants, and it's going to be a totally different style. Now, this garden bed is a little bit of a mixture. We've got our lettuce. It is not a long season crop. It is tender, but it's not super tender. We've got our pak choi. Same thing. It's not super crazy tender, but it is a little bit more tender. And then we've got our mustards and our kale and our collards, which are very hardy. They're not long season to produce, but they will last long season well into the winter, if not through the entire winter. That being said, now we need to start working on a fertilization schedule for all of this, right? And so we can do a little bit of a custom on this, and we can do a couple things. One, everything's going to stay the same for the granular. No worries, no rushes. We need to push growth on these lettuces to get them to go. And then in the back here, what we can do is once we're done with these and we say, hey, we don't want to push anything crazy, we don't want to do any water soluble, it's starting to get cold, we know that they get frostbitten easily, so we don't want to magnify that. Then what we can do is we can hand feed these crops, meaning we can put it in a jug and water them by hand with the, so what I would do is I would turn this off if I was going to do another feeding. This bed wouldn't get it, and then I would come and I would just spot feed those. That being said, there is a little bit of an issue. It's not major, but you know, roots don't just go straight down, they can spread out. So they may get a little bit of the benefit, but it won't be as much as if we just kind of fed the whole bed directly. It takes a little bit of a thought, you know, there's a little bit of a thought process behind it, and just thinking to yourself, like, what can we do? How are we going to make this better? How are we going to make this change? What are we going to do to make sure that each plant gets its own nutrients, this, that, and the other? And this is the big reason why I switched to drip irrigation, is because I can manage that. But we want to do high nitrogen, and we want to just continuously giving it to them. So slow releases and then quick shots. That's how I look at it. And doing this method in the spring, got me to where I got, for the first time ever, 100% broccoli harvest out of this bed. 100%.